What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we have another DeepRockGalactic tier list, and today we are doing another set of overclocks. Today we are covering the Scout's overclocks for all of his weapons. Last time we did this for the Engineer, and that went pretty well, and I kind of enjoyed that. So today we are going to be going through the Scout's overclocks. I changed up the tier listings a little bit. We have C, B, A, S, and Carl's Choice. Carl's Choice is basically the ones that I personally like to use a lot myself, or ones that are maybe not necessarily the most meta or game-breaking, but are just incredibly fun to use. And again, we're going to be going through all the ones for the primaries and secondaries and rating them based on my experience. And I feel like I need to say this at the top because I unfortunately waited until the end of the video last time in order to say this when I did the Engineers. Keep in mind that your tier list, if you do this, is going to look a lot different than mine. And that is perfectly okay. This is coming from my experiences with these overclocks. And if you feel differently about any of the placements that I have here, it's perfectly fine and I understand it, especially since I'm not a Scout main, so I don't necessarily have the most amount of experience with a lot of these overclocks, but I have used all of them to a good degree to at least know how I feel about using them. But if you feel differently, that's totally okay, and let me know down in the comments how you feel about it towards the end of it. If you like or hate my placements for it, I totally understand. But just keep in mind, this is again coming from my personal experience, so keep that in mind when watching this. Also, if you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to like and hit the bell so that way you never miss another upload in the future. Starting off, we have the GK2, the standard assault rifle, the first primary weapon that the Scout has, and this is probably one of the most universal, reliable weapons in the entire game, at least in my opinion. It's very, very easy to use. And the first overclock we have for it is compact ammo. This just gives you a little bit more magazine size and makes the recoil a little bit easier. This is pretty good. It's not game-breaking. It's not incredibly powerful for the GK2. It just makes it a little bit more effective, gives you a little bit more shots, and makes it a little bit easier to control. So I'm probably going to put this in the B tier. It's solid. It's going to do well, and it's not taking away anything from the gun. It's just a straight upgrade, and more shots and less recoil make it easier for you to hit targets. And then we have gas rerouting. This makes it so that we have a little bit faster rate of fire and a little bit quicker reload time. Again, the GK2 likes both of those things very much. The extra rate of fire is nice, lets you fling bullets a little bit faster, and the reload time is okay. The GK2 doesn't necessarily have a very bad reload time to begin with, but making it a little bit faster is also still good, and it's again never going to do any sort of hazard to you. So I'm probably going to put this in the B tier. Then next up, we have Homebrew Powder, which is an overclock that we've seen on a few weapons. And this has the randomized damage to where you will sometimes do a little bit more damage per shot or less damage per shot. The randomized element of this overclock might be a little bit annoying to some people, but overall, especially on the GK2, it's really not going to be that big of a deal because since this weapon fires very fast normally, even if you do get a stretch of a couple low rolls per shot, you're probably going to get a lot more high rolls to compensate for it, especially since the weapon fires very fast. And you have a little bit more leeway on the higher end of the rolls than you do the lower end, which is very useful. So more often than not, this is going to give you just a straight up damage increase, although not a crazy big damage increase. But again, you're still not really losing anything other than the potential for a couple of shots to be not quite as powerful. So I'm still probably going to put this in the B tier because it does help out overall in effectiveness with the GK2. If you're somebody who's not crazy about randomized stats or things of that nature, I totally get it. But at least in my experience, it more often than not just gives you a straight up damage increase than hindrance. Then next up, we have Overclock Firing Mechanism. Now this one makes the GK2 basically into a bullet hose. It gives you a lot more rate of fire at the cost of significantly worse recoil control. Even with the recoil control issue, it's still not that bad. The recoil for the GK2 is already not too crazy. So having a little bit worse recoil, even if you don't take the extra recoil mod, it's still not too terrible to control. And then you're basically just dealing with a faster rate of fire, which is always really good, especially on fast firing weapons like the GK2. So this can allow you to, again, turn it into basically just a little bullet hose and fling bullets out very quickly. It makes it really, really good for clearing up smaller enemies like grunts and slashers and whatnot. It may not be necessarily the best against bigger, tougher enemies, but it can still do wonders because, again, you're still just flinging out bullets a lot faster. So if you take armor breaking, you could shred armor very quickly. So honestly, I'd probably put this one up in the A tier. It's pretty solid and effective. Again, the recoil is not that big of a deal. And even if it is, you can just take the recoil mod to reduce it a little bit and be basically back to normal. And then you basically just have insanely fast rate of fire, which if you stack this up with more rate of fire, it can go really quickly. So next up, we have Bullets of Mercy. Bullets of Mercy makes it so that way you have a bit smaller magazine size, but you gain bonus damage towards any enemy that is affected by a status effect. And these are things like being on fire, frozen, stunned, electrocuted, neurotoxin, pheromones. There's a lot more status effects in the game than most people think about, especially since I believe not too long ago they made this effective with more status effects. So Bullets of Mercy is very useful if you are good at applying status effects to enemies, which the Scout on his own is very good at applying status effects. Electricity, ice, fire, basically everything in his kit has some potential to apply status effects, especially his grenade choices. Pretty much all of them do. And the GK2 itself also has the ability to stun enemies if you hit them in the weak spots, and if you take the improved stun chance in tier 5, it makes it way easier for you to proc this. So this is surprisingly really easy to proc, especially if you're on a team situation, because basically every class has some way or shape or form of dealing status effect damage. Especially if you have a driller on the team, you're basically always going to have this active because he pretty much only does status effects. So I'm honestly probably going to put this in the S tier. This is a really, really good one. The reduced magazine size might be a little bit annoying, but if you just take the bigger magazine size mod, it kind of counteracts this. So then you basically just have a straight damage increase, especially again, since it's really easy to proc. So yeah, Bullets of Mercy is really, really good. Then we have the most recent addition to the GK2's arsenal with the Burst Fire, which was added in Season 5. This is an overclock that I wish personally was a little bit better. Basically what this does is it makes it that with the GK2 fires in burst mode now, it technically does have a little bit more damage, and it also has increased stun chance when you hit weak spots and a little bit bigger magazine size at the cost of less overall rate of fire. It's honestly not too terrible. It just feels like it underperforms more than it should. The extra damage is really nice, and the actual shots themselves do fire out faster, which is kind of weird, but the fact that you fire the weapon in burst mode makes the rate of fire a lot slower. And I feel like it kind of just doesn't handle as well as it should, because if you're good at hitting your shots, this can be really, really good. If you're somebody who is just pinpoint accurate, who does not really miss anything, this can be a very solid and good overclock. The problem with it is it just, for some reason, feels like it just does not do nearly as much damage as you would think it does, especially considering the fact that it does give you a damage boost. Because if you are even just a little bit not good with hitting your shots, then you are essentially burning 3 shots at a time, which can make the ammo situation a lot worse. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a terrible overclock, but I would say that it is one that feels just a little bit too clunky. It feels like it's trying to buff but also nerf the weapon at the same time in a very weird way. So I'm probably going to put it in the C tier for right now. Again, some people might be able to work with this one a little bit better than me, but at least just in my experience, I feel like this just somehow lowers the effectiveness of the weapon to a certain degree. Again, unless you're somebody who's really, really good with hitting their shots. But if you are somebody who's really good with hitting their shots, then you're probably better off just going with our next choice, which is the AI Stability Engine. The AI Stability Engine is really good. Basically, it makes it so that the weapon has no recoil and pretty much no spread bloom whatsoever, and you have an extra 50% more damage towards enemy weak points at the cost of less overall damage and a slower rate of fire. The less damage and the slower rate of fire really do not make any issue with this particular overclock, and this is probably one of the best overclocks that the GK2 has access to, because it just makes it so easy to use. The no recoil and very little recovery just means you can basically just build pure raw damage and even ammo if you really wanted to. And the extra weak point damage is able to slay through things very quickly, big or small. So honestly, this is probably going to go up into Carl's choice. This is the one that I tend to use a lot when I go with the GK2. I also might go Bullets of Mercy every now and then because, again, it's really easy to use. But AI Stability Engine is just so easy, it's so forgiving, and it buffs the weapon in such a strong way. Even though it does technically nerf your damage, you're really not going to notice it if you're in the thick of an enemy fight. So then the last one we have for GK2 is Electrifying Reload. This makes it so that way you have significantly less ammo and less magazine size, but basically whenever you hit an enemy with a shot, it will embed a small electrical charge into them, and then when you reload, it will detonate all of them and deal electrical damage over time. This is actually really, really good. This has the potential to give the GK2 a lot of crowd control and, again, status effect application, which obviously you can't pair this up with Bullets of Mercy, but it is still just really useful to be able to apply massive damage over time effects to a large group of enemies and basically just slow down massive advancements. You can basically grind Praetorians to a halt if you do this properly. And it's just really, really good for just essentially having massive amounts of crowd control. It's probably the GK2's best form of crowd control. So honestly, we're probably going to put this one also up into the S tier. It's really, really good. It's very effective at just corralling and maintaining swarms incredibly well, and you can still do good damage to tough enemies. The extra ammo and magazine size are a little bit of a hit, but you can compensate for that a decent amount. And if you can get past that, this thing can do insane amounts of damage and crowd control for you. Now we're moving over to the M1000 Classic, the World War II-esque sort of M1 Garand inspired weapon. And the first overclock that we have access to is Hoverclock. Hoverclock is a fun and interesting little niche overclock, and basically what it does is it makes it so that way whenever you focus shot with the M1000 when in the air, you sort of hover for a little bit. The hover isn't insanely crazy. It doesn't keep you in the air for a long period of time. It's not like you can fly, but it is kind of nice for helping you get rid of fall damage, for giving you just a little bit of mobility, letting you hit an enemy that might be just in that weird sort of angle that you can't quite hit from anywhere else other than in the middle of the air. But outside of that, I never really found too much of a use for it other than just to meme around and again to save yourself. It's a very fun overclock, and it's a very unique overclock. So I think just for uniqueness factor alone, we're going to put this up into Carl's choice because it is very fun. And it's nice to just do sort of like, I guess, bullet time-esque type thing when you're in the air, which that alone is pretty fun. Is it the most practical thing in the world? No, not really. You really don't need this on the M1000, but you're not losing anything with it. You're not losing any sort of damage or anything. And this can, again, help you from really annoying heights if, for example, your grappling hook is on cooldown, or if you're not running special powder, which we'll talk about a little later. This can still be a fun thing to use. Is it the most practical thing in the world? No, but it's still very fun. And then the next option that the M1000 has is minimal clips. Minimal clips just gives you a little bit of a bigger magazine size and a little bit faster reload. M1000 likes both of those things. There's really no issue with this particular one. It has two things that the M1000 really likes, and especially on the M1000 where you have less ammo per shot, but each bullet per shot does significantly more damage. This can be really good with it. So honestly, we're probably going to put this one into A tier. It's really solid. You're really just going to be getting more overall performance out of the M1000 with this, and it will do wonders for you. Next up, we have Active Stability System. This one basically helps improve you if you like to do focus shots a lot. It makes it so that way you have a much faster movement speed when you are using focus shots, which normally it slows you down a lot. And it makes it so that way you actually focus and tighten the spread when you focus shot a lot faster. This comes at the cost of a little bit slower reload time. So this is really good if you are somebody who likes to use focus shots a lot. Personally, for me, I'm not a very big focus shot user with the M1000 unless I'm running a couple of specific setups. But that being said, one of the setups is using this because it is really good just to kind of keep you a little bit more mobile and give you a little bit less downtime. I'm personally somebody who I don't necessarily like to be slowed down or immobile most of the time unless it's something I'm in control of, and this is something I'm in control of, and it's still not that big of a deal. The extra movement speed when focusing is really nice and allows you to stay very mobile and really lean into the focus shots a lot more. And if you build this out again for a very heavy focus build, it can do a lot of damage very quickly and take out very big enemies or very big groups of enemies with relative ease. So we're honestly probably going to put this one in the A tier as well. This is a really good one. It makes it a lot easier for you to use the M1000 if you have not used it before. If you're somebody who's not used to the focus shot, this can kind of help wean you into it to a degree. You kind of don't want to use this too much though, because it is a little bit of a training wheel type overclock. But that being said, it is still really good. And then we have honestly a relatively controversial overclock that I've heard a lot of people talk about. Some people might like it, some people don't like it, but we have Hipster. Hipster basically gives you a crap ton more ammo, faster rate of fire, much better spread recovery, and much better recoil, but it nerfs your damage. The damage hit isn't really that bad. Even with this, you still have a good amount of damage on you. And again, this is definitely meant for more, I guess, of an unfocused shot setup, although you could still use this for focus shots and be pretty good. And at least in my opinion, this is a phenomenal overclock for the M1000, especially if you just gotten it. And similar to the active stability system, if you're somebody who's not super used to it, if you're not somebody who is very into the focus shots, this is good for you if you're really into just using the gun normally without focusing too much, which I feel like is a little bit easier for more people to do. The damage hit isn't really that noticeable. It's not going to lower the effectiveness that much. And you have just so much ammo and so much rate of fire that you can just fling this into crowds of enemies and still take out even relatively tough enemies very quickly. If you just mash the trigger, you can just melt things. And if you have like blow through rounds, you can take out groups of enemies very quickly. Honestly, this is probably going to be an S tier overclock. This is really good. And this is probably one of the ones that I like to use myself a lot. I wouldn't quite necessarily say it's Carl's choice because I do go back and forth between a lot of different overclocks for the M1000, especially now, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Hipster is just really good if you're somebody who does not like to do focus shots a whole lot, but you still want the weapon to be super effective and just very easy to use. But then next up, we have electrifying focus shots. This makes it so that way your focus shots themselves don't do as much damage. However, your shots now have the ability to electrocute enemies and hit them with the electrocution status effect. This is okay. I never really found myself using this one a whole lot because I feel like there are just a couple more straightforward ways for the scout to apply electrocution effects to enemies. Not saying that this is bad, and this can definitely do really good if you have like blow through rounds, because you can hit multiple different enemies and apply the electrocution effect that way. And you're also just going to, even though you are doing less damage with the focus shots, the electrocution damage over time is, I think, going to net you more damage overall, which is really nice. I'm probably going to put this one into the B tier. It's not bad. It's solid. All of these overclocks are solid. I feel like it's a little bit too specific. And if you're going to want to make your focus shots be more effective, I feel like there are a couple more ways that you could do it. And if you wanted to apply electrocution effects to enemies, the scout has a number of different ways that he can do that a little bit easier, in my opinion. Next up we have is the super cooling chamber. This one basically turns the M1000 into like a 50 cal. It makes it so that way your focus shots deal way more damage. You have significantly increased weak point damage bonus. However, your ammo, your clip size, your focus speed, and your movement speed while you are focusing are significantly nerfed. You cannot move at all when you're focusing, and it takes a long time for you to focus. So this is basically if you want to build a big game hunter-esque type build for it. And when you just want to take out one thing really, really effectively, you can also run this in a decent sort of crowd control build. If you take the blow through rounds, you can essentially, if the enemies can line up, you can go right through them, which can be kind of useful. But again, I'm not a big fan of having my mobility limited, and this definitely does that. Again, it can be very useful, especially on things like elimination missions where you want to take out one thing very effectively and very quickly. And if there's problematic threats, you can definitely get through them very well. So I'm probably going to put this one in the B tier. It is still good. It's just very, very difficult to use. And if this is one of the first overclocks that you got for the M1000, it might be a little bit more difficult just because, again, the fact that you aren't able to move when focusing and focusing takes so long, it's going to be a little bit more of a hassle for you to use. And also you're just going to have very little ammo. And then the last and newest addition for the M1000 is the new Marked for Death. This makes it so that way your focus shots are a little bit faster, so you can charge them up a little bit quicker. You basically don't do any focus shot damage at all. It does practically nothing, and your focus shots consume a little bit more ammo. However, it makes it so that way instead of dealing damage, instead the focus shot will actually temporarily mark enemies, making them highlighted for your teammates to see, and also make them take more damage from all sources for a short period of time. So basically you're putting a global debuff on them that makes anything deal more damage to them. This is a really, really good overclock, especially on a very well-coordinated team setup. Even on uncoordinated team setups, this can still be very good because it's just an overall damage buff. And even if you are playing solo, this can still be good because the damage buff still does apply to you. This can make taking out things like dreadnoughts or basically any sort of big enemy very easy to use. Just even some very simple combinations like this paired up with the gunner's mole for his coil gun can just delete dreadnoughts very quickly, or just basically any hard-hitting weapon or piece of equipment is going to deal significantly more damage with this. And really, you're not sacrificing a whole lot by using this because the only real thing that is applying to the weapon overall is the less clip size. Everything else only really applies when you are focus shotting the weapon. So if you want to use the weapon normally, just without really using focus shots, it will still function pretty well, other than, again, you will have a slightly smaller magazine size, which is really easy to work around. So ultimately, I think this is another S tier. This is really, really good, especially on a team. If you're by yourself, maybe it goes down to like high A tier, but for the most part, I would say this is definitely an S tier overclock and probably one of the better ones to come out of Season 5. It's really, really good. And again, it just makes the damage output of everybody on the team significantly higher. So now we are moving over to the DRAK Plasma Carbine, the energy weapon from Halo, as I like to call it. And the first overclock we have for this is aggressive venting. This makes it so that way when you overheat the weapon, it releases a burn AoE around you that can set enemies on fire and also fear them, and also slightly reduces your overheat duration. This is honestly a really good one. This is really good on the DRAK. It helps with downtime when you overheat, and the burn AoE can not only do good damage, but also take pressure off of you because it can knock enemies away, it can make them run away from you, which can help you a lot when you are in a tense situation. And if you just want to go for a very close range, sort of burn everything sort of build, this is very, very nice. And again, you're not losing anything with this since it is a clean overclock. So honestly, probably going to put this in the A tier. This is really good, and it just makes the DRAK even more effective than it already is, especially in close quarters situations. Then next up, we have thermal liquid coolant. This makes it so that way the weapon has a slightly better cooling rate and has a little bit less heat generated per shot. This is pretty good. It's not really going to do anything super crazy for the DRAK. It just gives you a little bit better heat management, which makes the gun a little bit easier to use. So probably going to put this into B tier. There's not really a whole lot to say about this one. It's good. It will allow you to be on target a little bit better, have a little bit more firepower out before you overheat, and not really much else besides that. Next up, we have impact deflection. Impact deflection makes it so that way the projectiles that you fire will bounce one time either off the terrain or the enemy that they hit, which can be very nice, at the cost of the weapon having a slightly slower rate of fire. Slower rate of fire really isn't that big of a deal on the DRAK, especially since there are ways that you can increase it directly and indirectly. So the lower rate of fire isn't really that big of a deal. And if anything, it's just going to help you manage your heat a little bit better, because it's just naturally going to be going up a lot slower because you're firing slower. And the bouncy projectiles can actually be pretty good. The way you kind of want to use this overclock a little bit is you want to actually fire slightly below the enemy. So you kind of want to fire at the floor beneath them, because what it'll do is, especially if you have something like Plasma Splash, which increases the splash damage of each individual projectile, it'll hit the ground, splash, deal damage, hit the enemy that's right above it, and then it'll bounce up and then hit that enemy again, bursting, splashing, and dealing damage. So you're kind of hitting the enemy twice for one bullet, which can be very useful. It's a little bit tricky to get used to, but once you do and you find yourself doing it, it makes this thing hit significantly harder. But even if you don't go with that particular tactic and you just fire the weapon normally into crowds of enemies, you'll still get shots that will bounce off of one enemy onto another enemy. Or if you just miss and you hit the terrain, there's a good chance that it'll bounce off and hit towards another enemy. It's not like the magic bullets that the gunner's weapons have, where they will track onto nearby enemies. This kind of depends on the angle at which you hit them from. They kind of follow the physics as to where you bounce them off of, so you kind of have to keep that in mind. But ultimately, this is just a really good damage increasing overclock if you know how to shoot it properly. And again, the rate of fire is really not that big of a deal. So honestly, I'm probably going to put this one into the A tier. This is really, really good for the DRAK and is a relatively simple one to use that will just basically give you a really good damage buff. Then we have the DRAK's new overclock with Season 5, which is the conductive thermals. This is a really good and really unique overclock as well. What this does is it makes it that way your shots apply a temporary buff to the amount of ice, fire, and electrical damage that hits an enemy, and also makes it so that way the enemy is easier to light on fire and also freeze. It makes it so that way their temperature is raised or lowered much faster. The drawback is its overall damage is reduced and that you generate a little bit more heat per shot. Even with those drawbacks, this is still a really good overclock and incredibly effective, especially when on a team situation again. This is actually, I think, the only way that you can consistently light dreadnoughts on fire, because the amount of buff that you get to this, which allows you to increase the amount of heat that's generated, you can actually light dreadnoughts effectively on fire with this. I believe Ron actually made a video talking about that, which if I can find it, I'll link it in the description so you can see it, but it's very effective. But even outside of that, again, since elemental effects and status effects are very, very useful and common across all the classes, especially fire and ice, this is a very effective way to increase your damage output. The only real issue with this is that if you want the DRAK itself to do any real form of damage, you kind of have to take the overcharged PCF in tier 4, which gives you a chance to electrocute enemies on hit, because then the DRAK can essentially buff its own damage, which is kind of the only way that you're really going to do any real damage with this weapon. If you don't do that, you're basically using this just to buff your allies, which can still be good if you want to play a very heavy support role. But ultimately, I'm probably going to put this in the S tier as well, because this, again, can fit on so many different builds. It can benefit so many different people. It can benefit basically all of the classes. And yes, the drawbacks are a little bit annoying, but are very easy to work around. And the fact that you can buff your own elemental capabilities. So if you're running things like the cryo grenades, or if you're running incendiary shells for the shotgun, or basically just any of your grenades will benefit from this essentially, except for pheromones. It's just a really solid, good way to just give both you and the team a little bit more damage output, which seems to be what they were going for with the Scout in terms of Season 5. Then next up, we have the rewiring. Rewiring mod is really cool because basically what it does is it makes it so that way your overall battery capacity is lower and you have a longer overheat duration, so you stay overheated for longer. But basically what happens is when you are overheated, you regenerate lost ammo that you shot. And the conversion rate to this is actually really good. If you use, say, 10% of your ammo in one volley and you overheat, you will probably get about 5% of your ammo back, so you're only really using about half of the ammo that you spent before you overheated. This can be really, really good for giving you consistent and steady ammo in the course of a long fight. If you're somebody who finds that the DRAK is running out of ammo very often, this might be the overclock that helps you out a lot. Yes, your overheating is going to be a little bit more annoying, but you're just going to see that you're going to be able to go through battery after battery and overheat constantly and still have plenty of ammo left over by the time the fight's over. That being said, the overheat is a little bit annoying, and the fact that you don't really have a whole lot of ways to work with it can be a little bit of a detriment, but I'd still probably put this in the solid B tier. It's pretty good, especially for, again, maintaining your ammo. It doesn't do a whole lot outside of that, and it doesn't necessarily do a whole lot for your damage increasing. So I would say this is pretty much exclusively good for swarm control and just basically taking out the smaller enemies, but in that regard, it does do pretty well. Then next up, we have the Overtuned Particle Accelerator. This makes it so that way the direct damage that the DRAK does is significantly higher, so it does way more damage per shot, but you have significantly less battery capacity, you generate a lot more heat per shot, and the spread is increased. And it's increased a lot. It spreads a lot more. Even if you do take the accuracy increase, it can kind of help with this a little bit, but ultimately this is basically going to make the DRAK a close quarters powerhouse machine. That being said, this can still be very good for increasing the damage on the DRAK. The DRAK itself doesn't necessarily hit super duper hard unless you build it out for that way, but this can help you out a lot with it. It does kind of make your heat and battery management a little bit harder, but if you're able to be a little bit more careful, keep an eye on the weapon's heat, or just build accordingly to it, this can make it so that way the DRAK hits really hard. This can probably make it so that way the DRAK hits harder than most of the other overclocks that it has access to, so I'm honestly probably going to put it in A tier for that, because if you're looking for something that just makes it so that way the DRAK can function very effectively on its own without having to really worry too much other than just your heat management, then this is probably going to be the best thing for you. It is a little bit hard to use, but if you are able to use it, it definitely makes the DRAK hit like a truck. Then next up, we have a Shield Battery Booster. This makes it so that way increases the damage and projectile speed of the weapon when you have full shields. It also makes it so that way you have a faster rate of fire, a bigger battery capacity, and it also makes your shields regen a little bit faster. And all this is at the cost of it cools a lot slower, you generate more heat per shot, and if you overheat with the weapon, it will burn your shields and knock them down. One thing to note about this is that the increased damage and projectile speed only applies literally when you have full shields. If you have anything less than full shields, so if you have like 99% shield, or if you just take like one hit, you immediately lose the buff that this overclock provides. This is a really difficult overclock to use, at least in my opinion. I've never really found a way to use this a whole lot. Granted, it does synergize kind of well with the Shield Link perk. It does kind of have some interesting sort of synergies with that. But aside from that very niche factor, this is kind of an overclock that I've always had a little bit of difficulty using, because it obviously wants you to maintain max shields, which even on the higher hazard levels is very difficult to avoid to even have your shields taken down even just a little bit. Regardless of enemies, if you just hit one small hazard, that's it, your shields are done, and then this thing basically does nothing other than just give you a little bit faster rate of fire and a little bit more battery capacity, which is nice. The worse heat management and the worse cooling rate is kind of what makes this really tough, especially when it overheats. It takes away your shields, which on high hazard levels can be very difficult. So I'm probably going to put this one in the C tier. It can work if you build it up properly, but it's a very specific niche strategy that I feel like you need to have a lot of different pieces in place for it to work properly. And if you don't have literally the setup that you need for this, it's just going to be very difficult to control, and you're going to have less shields more often than not. Also, this basically is completely useless if you're on any mission that has shield disruption as a modifier, which granted, you probably wouldn't take this anyway, but it just kind of sucks that if you want to use this and that modifier is active, you literally can't even if you wanted to. And then lastly, for the DRAK, we have the thermal exhaust feedback. This makes it so that way, as the weapon goes up in heat past 50%, you can deal extra fire damage per shot and light the enemies on fire, with the drawback again being worse overheat duration and more heat generated per shot. This is a pretty decent one, in all honesty, if you're able to control it. If you're not able to control it, it can be a little bit more worse off. The extra heat damage is actually really impressive, especially once you start getting into the higher percentages of heat. The only real problem is that this is a overclock that wants you to stay above 50% heat, which makes sense, but it also makes it so that way it's really hard to maintain that high heat with the fact that it makes your overheat and heat generation much worse. So if you're able to maintain that sweet spot of being above 50% heat, this can actually do some really good work and can light enemies on fire relatively quickly. The problem is you basically never want to get that low, and you never really want to overheat because you're going to be wasting a lot more time. That being said, it can do some pretty good damage if you're able to get that off. So I'm probably going to put this one in the B tier. It's good. It can definitely work if you build up for it. It's just a little bit awkward to control, especially since you have to sort of maintain that sweet spot in order to keep the fire damage as consistent as you can. So now we're finally on to the secondary weapons, and the first one we have is the jury-rigged Boomstick, the double-barrel shotgun that everybody loves. And the first overclock option we have is compact shells. It just gives you more ammo and a faster reload time. Boomstick loves both of those things. There's never really going to be a situation where you're not going to want to use this, so I'm probably just going to put this in the B tier. It is good, it's solid, it's not going to do you wrong. The Boomstick loves both of those things. It loves more ammo and it loves a faster reload time, so perfectly fine for me. Then next up we have one of the most famous overclocks in the entire game, which is Special Powder. Special Powder makes it so that way you have the ability to essentially shotgun jump. If you fire the shotgun, it will push you in the opposite direction, provided you're in the air. If you're on the ground, this won't do anything. It'll just fire the weapon normally. But if you are in the air or disconnected from the ground in any way, shape, or form, when you fire this, it'll fling you back in the opposite direction. This is a really fun overclock. This is honestly one of the most fun overclocks in the entire game. Is it super duper practical from a combat perspective? Not necessarily, because you're not losing anything with this particular overclock. You're not losing any damage, you're not losing any ammo, you're not losing anything for it. You're just getting more mobility, which can be very useful in some combat situations. Again, it's very niche and it does a very unique thing, and it is super duper fun. So I'm probably going to put this up into Carl's choice because, again, it's similar to the hover clock because you don't necessarily need this to exist in order for the Boomstick to function well, but it is just insanely fun. It can save you from falling, again, if your grappling hook is on cooldown or something and you misjudge it or whatever the case may be. And the weapon still does function normally on its own. Just make sure that you're not in the air when you want to use it as an actual shotgun to hit enemies, or else you will go flying back, because I have done that to myself many of times. But if you can get above that, this is a incredibly fun and very useful overclock, at least from a movement speed perspective. And then next up, we have stuffed shells, which just gives you more damage and more pellets for the shotgun. Both of those things are phenomenal for the shotgun. It's just going to make it do even more damage. It's going to make it hit even harder. So honestly, this is going to go right into the A tier. It's solid. It's really good. It's just going to overall increase your damage output, which is perfectly fine. Then next up, we have the only balanced overclock, which is shaped shells. That was really hard to say. This makes it so that way the weapon has a bit better spread at the cost of less ammo. Even with that, this is still really good, and this actually makes it so that way the shotgun is really effective at longer ranges than you would expect. The spread and accuracy tighten is really useful at making all the pellets hit, and the less ammo isn't really that big of a deal because you can build out for that, but again, you're also probably not going to be using the shotgun as often as some of your other weapons anyway. This is really good for taking out those bigger, tougher enemies that are a little bit longer range than you would normally be comfortable with the shotgun, and it overall just gives it a much better accuracy and much more damage consistency, since it's much more likely that all the pellets are going to hit the target. So I'm probably going to keep this one in the A tier as well. This is really good for just overall making the shotgun more user-friendly. Then after the shaped shells, we have jumbo shells. There's a lot of shell overclocks. This one basically makes the damage for the Boomstick insanely high at the cost of significantly less ammo and a longer reload time. You're really not going to care about both of those drawbacks when you see how hard this thing hits. It makes it really strong, makes it hit like a truck. This can make the Boomstick just absolutely be able to delete things very effectively. The ammo reduction is a little bit annoying, and the reload time does kind of suck, but if you take the auto reload mod that it has, or if you run Born Ready, which is a very common perk that a lot of people use, you can basically just use this to delete whatever big thing you want and then just switch to your primary weapon. Then after a couple seconds, switch it back out and then it's ready to go. And the ammo, you just kind of have to basically be a little bit more careful with it. If you are running this, you are probably going to use this as your big target destruction weapon anyway, which kind of will help you be a little bit more conservative with the ammo because you're not going to want to use it on the smaller groups of enemies to begin with. So I'm going to put jumbo shells right up in the S tier. It's great. It's phenomenal, and it just makes it so that way a weapon that already hits really hard hits even harder. And then right behind it and very close in power, we have the double barrel. Double barrel makes it so that way you fire both barrels at the same time, but the shockwave that the boomstick has in front of it when you fire is significantly stronger. It hits a lot stronger, but you have, obviously, you only fire one shot, and the amount of ammo that you have is reduced, and the recoil and spread is a lot worse. So it's kind of like the inverse of shaped shells, but ramped up to the extreme. Even with those drawbacks, double barrel is still really, really solid. It does kind of suck that you have to use both shells at the same time, and that could kind of make it a little bit more difficult to use. But if you're able to get around that, this can do really high burst damage to single targets. This doesn't have the same sort of problem that the jumbo shells have with the quicker reload time, so you can actually reload this relatively quickly. And just the amount of quick burst damage that you're able to do is really, really good. So honestly, I'm probably going to put this like close to the top of A tier. Again, I don't put these in any specific category or any specific rating on their tiers unless I specify otherwise. But this is kind of encroaching on S tier, but we're going to put it in the A tier just because jumbo shells is a little bit more easy to use for a lot of people, and overall it will probably be a little bit more effective. But double barrel is really good for just dealing very heavy burst damage to one enemy. Next up, we have the Zhukovs, the dual pistols that are probably the weapon that I have the least amount of experience with the Scout. Thankfully, they don't have that many overclocks, so there's not really a whole lot to talk about because they're all relatively basic. First, we have minimal magazines. This just makes it so that way you have a bit faster rate of fire and a bit slower reload time. This is fine. There's nothing really too problematic with this. The Zhukovs like both of these things. Being able to reload faster is always good, and if you stack this with reload speed, you can get a practically 0-second reload speed. And the rate of fire is nice. The Zhukovs love high rate of fire, so we're going to put it in the B tier. Nothing really too crazy, nothing fancy, and just a solid overall overclock. Then we have custom casings. This makes it so that way you have a significantly more ammo for this thing, but the overall rate of fire is a lot slower. This honestly isn't really that bad. I still think this is a very serviceable overclock. In fact, this is probably a good one to start off with for the Zhukovs because the Zhukovs have a very weird sort of unique style for their ammo and rate of fire to where both weapons will be consumed at the same time, but you'll only be using half ammo. It's very difficult to describe, but essentially that's kind of how it works. So this can kind of help you learn how it works a little bit better because when you're firing slower, it's not going to be nearly as obvious how much this is working. And because you have more ammo, you can lean into it a little bit more. So I'm probably going to put this in the B tier as well. This is nice. It's not going to hurt you too much. The rate of fire is not really that big of a deal, and just having more shots is always a good thing. Next up, we have cryo mindlets, which is a unique one. It makes it so that way the damage is a lot lower and makes it so that way the combined magazine size is a lot lower. However, your bullets actually are then converted into cryo mines, which when they hit the ground or surface, they will embed themselves into the ground, and after a short period of time or when an enemy walks over them, they will detonate and deal cryo damage over time. This is really good, in all honesty, for the Zhukovs because it allows them to have a lot more damage output in a unique way. Status effect damage, especially cold damage, is very useful, and it has the ability to affect enemies in a unique way and also set up and prime a lot of other things for a lot of other classes, especially cryo damage is just really, really useful because enemies that are frozen just take triple damage overall. And this gives the Zhukovs a lot more crowd control, and the Zhukovs really like to have that sort of thing. So I'm probably going to put this up into the A tier. Just really solid elemental effects that the Zhukovs can capitalize on very well. Then next up, we have embedded detonators. This is very similar to the one that the GK2 has, but a little bit different. This makes it that way you have significantly less ammo, significantly less magazine size, and the overall damage is really low, but it functions similarly to the GK2 where the shots will embed small explosives into the enemy, and once you reload, it will detonate all those explosives and deal damage. This is still pretty good. In fact, this is probably a lot better than the GK2's version because this just makes it so that way the Zhukovs have significantly more damage output because the explosions are actually really strong. The damage might be nerfed for the weapon itself, but the explosion from the embedded detonators is really, really high. You're able to take out groups of enemies as well as just big, gigantic threats really well. So honestly, this is probably going to be in the S tier. This is really good. The Zhukovs are already bullet hoses, and this just makes them so that way they're explosive bullet hoses, which is really, really good. Again, the ammo hit is a little bit more annoying. The fact that you're dealing just so much damage and able to just take out things very quickly more than make up for it. Then lastly, we have gas recycling. Gas recycling makes it so that way you have significantly more damage with the Zhukovs. They have really high armor breaking, but they have no weak point damage multiplier at all, so they basically can't do weak point crits anymore. They have a little bit more spread, and you move slower when you use them. Now, normally, I'm not a fan of moving slower when using things, and that is true for the most part. This, however, is one of the few exceptions, just because this thing makes it so that way these Zhukovs hit insanely hard, like super duper hard. And even though you're not getting any weak point damage, you really don't care, because with the amount of armor breaking you're getting with this and the amount of extra damage, you're shredding basically anything that's in front of you. It basically turns the Zhukovs from like dual machine pistols to like dual 50 cal pistols. It's ridiculous. They hit so hard. They're able to shred ammo so quickly. Yes, the lower movement speed is a little bit more annoying, but if you really wanted to, you could take something like the get in, get out in tier 5, where after you empty the clips, you move faster. So it kind of makes up for it a little bit, because you're going to be reloading these things still relatively often. And overall, these things just hit so hard. So I think we have another Carl's choice here. When I'm using the Zhukovs, this is what I like to use, just because I don't really have to think too much about it. I just get to just have an insanely powerful pair of pistols. Wow, that was an alliteration I did not plan on saying, but there it is. And overall, these things just hit really, really hard, especially for a secondary weapon, that they can take out basically anything you need. Then finally, we have the Nishanka Boltshark Crossbow. The crossbow is probably one of the more universal weapons in the entire game. It has a lot of versatility to it, and its overclocks kind of just help it in a lot of ways. First up, we have quick fire. This makes it so that way the reload time is quicker and your projectiles have more velocity. This is good. The crossbow likes both of these stats. It's not really that big of a deal. It's not anything crazy, so I'm probably just going to put this in the B tier. Solid. It's not going to do really anything for you. Just a straight upgrade. Then we have the Specialist. Specialist makes it so that way you have more special bolts, and the effect duration of your special bolts is increased. This is pretty good. Special bolts for the crossbow are really useful and can fill a lot of roles. The pheromone bolts are incredibly effective. The taser bolts are really nice for spreading status effects, and the explosive bolts can do pretty well at crowd control, although they probably are the ones that I personally use the least. And just having more of them and having them be more effective can help in a lot of different ways. And again, you're not really losing anything from this, so I'm probably going to put this in the A tier. This is really, really good, especially since the special bolts for the crossbow are very universal in a lot of ways. Then we have the cryo bolts. This makes it so that way your bolts are no longer retrievable and do less damage themselves. However, it makes it so that way the bolts, when they impact either the terrain or an enemy, they will freeze anything that is nearby. They will lower their temperature until they are eventually frozen. This is really, really good. The cryo bolts, as I've said before, are really strong because cryo is really strong. Just the cryo effect in general is incredibly effective. You're slowing down the enemy, and then if they fully get frozen, you basically have free mega crits on them, because that's just how freezing works. And this is really good, especially on something like the Boltshark, because you're able to combo this very well. You throw some pheromone bolts into an enemy to get all the enemies to crowd around them, and then you throw a couple cryo bolts in them, and then or fire bolts, which we'll talk about later. But then you basically just had the effect spreading to multiple different enemies, which is insanely strong. So honestly, cryo bolts is probably going to be in the S tier. This is incredibly effective, especially when you're dealing with bigger, tougher threats that you want to make brittle and easy to take out. And then we have fire bolts, which function the exact same way as the cryo bolts, except for instead of freezing them, it of course lights them on fire. This is also really good. Fire is a very generally useful damage type in the game because very few things are resistant to fire. That being said, it's not quite as effective as cryo, because while fire does do really good for damage over time effects, the fact that cryo makes it so that way things take like triple damage when they're frozen is just insanely effective. So I probably put these at like higher A tier, because while they're pretty much really close to the cryo bolts, just the fact that they don't have that sort of massive amount of crowd control and it's more just damage over time is probably the only thing that's dropping it a little bit, but they are still very effective. Then for the unstable overclocks, the first one we have is bodkin points. Yes, I said it right this time. I had a build video a couple weeks ago where I had these and I kept on calling them the wrong thing. So I apologize, and now I have rectified it. But bodkin points basically makes it so that way your normal bolts have the ability to ricochet up to 2 times to different enemies. They deal less damage and you have a longer reload time, however. This is still really good. The bodkin points have the ability to just take out large groups of enemies surprisingly effectively. The fact that they can bounce between enemies is also really fun to watch. The reload speed is a little bit annoying, but you can compensate for that. And overall, this just gives the crossbow even more versatility than it already has because it takes it away from being just a single target tool to a more of a semi-crowd control tool. So I'm probably going to put this one in the A tier because this is, again, really good. It's really solid. Yes, the drawbacks are a little bit annoying, but you're going to be kind of making up more for it with the fact that the bolts ricochet, and it's overall going to be able to do a lot more damage. And then finally, we have the tri-fork volley. This makes it so that way when you fire 3 bolts out in a fan-like pattern. You have a lot more ammo to work with it to compensate for it. The bolts are no longer retrievable and they have less damage per projectile, and the reload time is a lot longer. This is still really, really good. The fan-like pattern is easy to sort of work to your advantage because if you're close range, it's not really going to be that big of a deal because you're just going to hit all the bolts onto one enemy. But if you're able to electrify the enemy in any way, shape, or form with either the stun sweepers or the IFGs or any of the scouts other ways that he can electrify things, if you take the magnetic shafts mod in tier 5, you can make it so that way basically all of the bolts will just track to the enemy that is electrified. So regardless of if there's a spread or not, you're still going to basically be hitting 3 bolts onto one enemy, and that they're taking more damage because they're electrified. It kind of counteracts the reduced damage that the tri-fork volley does. So ultimately, you can get some really interesting setups with this, and even if you don't have that, the fact that you're just firing out 3 bolts can do a lot of damage to single big threats like dreadnoughts. Ultimately, I'm probably going to put this one also in the A tier. It's really effective. It's a little bit hard to use at first, but once you do, you can learn that this has a lot more versatility in many different setups. And there we have all of the Scouts Overclocks as of Season 5 of DeepRockGalactic, rated and put into this tier list. I'm not really surprised or upset with where my position is for these. Some of them could probably be changed around a little bit, but for the most part, I'm happy with them. And again, keep in mind that this is just my experiences, and basically all of these overclocks, regardless of where they are put on this list, can be useful in some way, shape, or form, and you can basically make any overclock in this game into an S tier or a Carl's Choice tier if you build it out right or if you just use it good enough. This is just my experience with all of these overclocks for the Scout. Again, the Scout is probably the class that I have the least amount of time in, or at least the least amount of practical experience in, so this is just how I feel about it. And let me know how you guys feel down in the comments as to where I put these things. Do you agree with my positions? Do you not think that I have any of the right things in the right spot? Let me know down in the comments, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to be very confused as to why I put certain things in certain places, which I cannot wait to hear. And again, just use whatever overclocks you like at the end of the day. All of these are great, and if one of them is your favorite, just go for it. Deep Rock is a game where you can pretty much use whatever you want and everything will be effective in some way. But anyway, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps out the channel a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, see you in the next video.